Rafki and Beth for opening up this space. This is the second time that I presented here. The first time, there was some material that's in the book and that I was working on, and they really helped me with some of the historical and actual institutional architecture of New Orleans. Who are the members of key boards and commissions, and where do they fit into New Orleans politics and history, and why are they important, and how are they connected? And this is knowledge that in the 6 years that I was here, I learned a bit about, but there's folks like Wade and Beth and Marie and others who really kind of know the city inside and out, and have been organizing and engaged in struggles to open up the city and make it a little bit more progressive and responsive. And so, I learned a lot from folks like them and the folks that are here. And while we were here, I was involved. We were here from 2008 to 2013. Luna was born here. We were involved in a variety of different struggles and trying to support different organizations that were doing good things in the city. And when I left in 2013, I sort of decided, okay, there's a book in this. And so the work that has been going on in terms of the boards and commissions and poorly monitored entities in public government, the work that I've been doing with Vanessa and Justine and others around the construction that was going on in the city, and the construction workers, and many of whom weren't getting paid. Work that I was doing with Vanessa also with restaurant workers, and Jana was on that board too. There's some of the tourism sector, there are additional problems and things that we were working on and observing, and working with Jana on the Avondale Shipyard project, and so working at the manufacturing sector. So bringing all this work together, I sort of decided that there was a story to be told, and it deserved to have its own coherent project, and that's what this book became. And it took too long to write, but it's out now, and it's been out for about a year, and I presented it a couple times. And most of all, I wanted to make sure that it was available here in New Orleans, and that I had a chance to talk about it a bit and connect with folks, and then it could hopefully contribute to the conversations that people are having here. So I think I want to talk for about 25 minutes or so. So I'm just going to start my little timer, because I know that listening to me for any longer would be kind of enough for this space, but also just to encourage a little conversation afterwards, see where people want to go with it. For me, this project was especially interesting because Katrina was something that it was a dividing point. It was a moment when everything changed. So really understanding the way in which those moments, and there aren't really many that everybody shares in that really historically important way. 9/11, Katrina, these are things that we all watched in slow motion on TV, and so as a result, they marked time for many, many people. And in New Orleans, obviously, it marks this historical moment, this dividing moment, when everything changed. But at the same time, Katrina accelerated and punctuated a transition that is happening in many, many different cities, and that has taken decades to unfold in many different cities. But here it was really punctuated and accelerated by that moment. If there's one takeaway from this book, or from the way in which I want to present this book, is that I see the city, and many cities, as having been captured by a globally oriented faction of the local elite. And they've captured local politics, the local state, and they seek to increase their profits, their accumulation, by segmenting sectors according to ascriptive characteristics like race and gender and national origin. And once they take control of the sectors in which they're active and link them up to the international economy, they leave the rest of the city, the rest of the population behind. So if this is the kind of the central takeaway from what happened here, what I understand is happening in many cities, I also wanted to make sure that I didn't write a depressing book. There is a lot that's depressing about the post-Katrina situation in New Orleans, but working people have resisted, and neighborhoods and communities have resisted. And so I also wanted to make sure that I highlight and I emphasize the ways in which those episodes of resistance share something, the core strategies and content of that resistance, and what I think it means and what it articulates as far as an alternative to that globally oriented strategy that local elites have promoted. There's a couple of concepts that are activated in this book. paradigm is dual development, which is an old international development idea. Sir Arthur Lewis talking about the Caribbean. He observed that in the Caribbean, you had these island economies in which you had enclaves that were linked up internationally, were modern, using highly productive processes, connected to the international economy, but were totally unconnected to the rest of society. You had a subsistence and poor society on the outer bounds outside of this enclave. And so this concept of dual development is something that I draw on to think about what's happening in New Orleans and in other cities. And then also the notion of dual appears additionally in terms of segmentation and segmented. So Michael Piori has a notion of segmented markets or segmented labor markets in which you have some good jobs and then lots of bad jobs. And that's kind of what characterizes these dynamic sectors in New Orleans, is that there were a few good jobs created and opened up, but many bad jobs created. And the assignment to good and bad jobs was on the basis of these descriptive characteristics like race and gender and national origin, had nothing to do with how good you were at your job. And that this kind of segmentation has a big impact on inequality, on the possibility of mobility. You can't train up to go from the bad job in the back of the house that has low wages and dangerous conditions to the good job in the front of a fine dining restaurant, if you're assigned your job on the basis of your race or your gender. And so these concepts of duality or segmentation are kind of evident in New Orleans, but at the same time there were these possibilities and episodes of resistance. And I don't want to overstate it. I think that resistance has been a losing struggle in many kind of general cases, but those episodes of victory are important to highlight, to understand what is it that allows working people and communities to fight what this experience is, and this elite-oriented development project that's being imposed on them. And as far as the concepts that kind of are present in this resistance, the main ideas that I draw on are notions of production and social reproduction. And so it's the fact that working people and communities joined up their struggles. And their struggles were about social reproduction. The ability of people to present themselves each day for work is impinged on by racism, by the xenophobia that characterizes the anti-immigrant practices that operate. And so these ways of stripping people of their dignity in their daily lives and in their communities means that then they're weakened. They're unable to resist when they're given the bad jobs and bad conditions at work. And so there's this connection between the struggles to establish a degree of dignity in your home life and the struggles to establish a decent working life in your productive activities. And so it's this joined up struggle of communities and workplaces that is evident in these moments of resistance when they're successful, and that I wanted to draw on. To make this argument, I organized the project around two kinds of comparisons. One is over time, and one is across sectors. And so over time, I traced the evolution of local regimes. And so people talking about urban politics, New Orleans politics, have understood that local regimes are the way in which elite power holders join up to and draw on social bases to implement a development project, a project for a city. In New Orleans, we see this dual development project, this globally oriented project, as a regime. And I think it can be characterized that way after Katrina. And what's interesting about tracing this over time, the transition from the before and after period, is that you can see for 150 years of New Orleans history, different transitions in the political regime in terms of who were the local power holders, what social bases did they draw on, and then what was their project, what it was that they were trying to get done. And what became interesting about tracing these regimes over time is, well, first, that there was a clear before and after in Katrina, in which just before Katrina, and this contributed to why the city was so damaged and unable to respond to the hurricane, was that there was kind of a stalemate amongst different local factions of the elite. There was a fragmented elite structure. No one was able to impose a real regime project. And so you have a non-regime or an inability to get things, to mobilize resources to get things done. And then that's replaced after Katrina by this very coherent, dual development, globally integrated project. I could trace this through those boards and commissions and public benefit corporations that Beth and Wade and others helped me to make sense of. And that sub-part of this project came out because I was having a conversation one day in a meeting, and Bob Sarasoli, who was the Auditor General at the time, was there in the meeting, and he said, you know, he was the auditor of sort of public government, the budget and finance and things like this. And he said, you know, I've got this problem, which is that I keep on discovering that there are these different entities, these commissions that govern something in public life, and I didn't even know about them. They have a budget, they have legal, background and a board, and I didn't know that what they did or how they operate, and they kind of exist off budget or in a difficult to monitor way. And so he was just making notes on a Post-it and sticking them on his wall. And so I said, I need to go see your wall. And I went to his office, and on his wall he had, about 100 different Post-its with the names of the levy board and the school board and other boards that we may have heard of, but then lots of other ones that we hadn't heard of, but that have budgets and boards and power over public life that are just really difficult to observe. And so with a colleague at Tulane, we put together a project, and we made a documentation of all those entities. We call them satellite entities because they're kind of connected to public life and government, but revolving or orbiting around it. And we found over 250 of these, and you can kind of map them in terms of, well, when were they created? What did they say about the regime that was creating these entities at that moment? Why is it they wanted to hide or establish public power in these ways at that moment? The levy board being created in the 1990s, or the New Orleans Recreation District being created in the 2010s. These express something about the regime that's in place at these different moments. You can trace that over time. And what we saw in that period right before Katrina to after is that in the 60s and 70s, certain kinds of these satellite entities were being created. And what was happening was that the white elite of the city saw the writing on the wall. They saw that the black majority of the city was going to gain electoral power, was going to assert that electoral power in certain ways. They started to create a whole host of different satellite entities that privatized, that ring-fenced, and that and ultimately we see that they came upon these dual development entities that would promote a tourism and services economy that was focused on these globalized integrated processes. And so I mentioned ring fencing, and we see something like the Audubon Security District, which creates a public good like security in that neighborhood that the members of that neighborhood get to benefit from, but nobody else does. And so they ring fence this thing that we think is a public good, but actually they make it into a club good. And then we see privatizing, like the Audubon Nature Institute, where they take something that used to be public, like Audubon Park and golf course and zoo and the area protected by the Audubon Security District, and then they hand it over to the private sector for accumulation, so that the private sector can make money off of that previously public entity. And then we see an entity like the Audubon Commission, which is in charge of all these different entities and the insectarium also and these other things, and is oriented towards setting themselves up and integrating with these globally oriented tourism sectors and processes. And so the connection, and I chose that one for obvious reasons because it's got Audubon in the title and all three, but there is this notion that first you ring fence, then you privatize, and then you use that public and private power to kind of reorient the economy in this globally integrated way. And we see this kind of linkage, and you can see it in the networks that join all these entities. So you can go in the book, you can see it, and you can go online to nolasatellitegovernment.com. And my colleague at Tulane, David Marcello, and I made up a website of all the 250 plus entities, and you can kind of like surf from one to the next based on how their board members are connected to each other. And you can see that there is this connection, this tight link between the ring fencing, privatizing, dual development entities. And this isn't to say that the African American elite didn't get into the action too. So as they created these black-led regimes in the 70s and 80s and 90s, well, they set up these African American incorporating entities, which kind of set up social services like Total Community Action, that was like a job training and welfare service provider that would available to the African American community, and in large part did deliver services to those communities, part of the Great Society programs of the 60s and 70s, but also kind of set up jobs for those middle class black bourgeoisie of the city that wanted to then get into these public areas of power, and this was a way for them to do so. And so what you end up with in that pre-Katrina period is this stalemate between the privatizing, ring-fencing dual development project and the black-led regime project, and so ultimately you don't really have a coherent project for the city, and you know, this gives New Orleans part of its character, this stagnating, stalemating feeling, but it's also a story of a government that's unable to really get much done. Katrina shakes this up because it disorganizes, discombobulates those neighborhood organizations that were kind of the core, at least of the electoral power of much of the black-led regime. And also, you know, that regime had also proven itself unable to get as much done as any set of governments might want to get done. And so you got this moment in 2005, and that's why it kind of punctuated, when the white elite that had been driving this tourism and dual development project along sees that now they can recapture access to the state. And so this is what happens after Katrina. And there is a racial element to this politics, but of course, very quickly, it becomes guided and oriented around, or divided along class lines. And so those actors who are willing to go along with this dual development project, they sign up to it. And we see, you know, the return of black politicians into the city council, into the mayor's office. But the condition of access now is, will you go along with this dual development, globally integrated project? And so we see a white elite and a black elite, an upper class project that is shared across these groups that's now kind of coherent in terms of the way in which it's being put in place. And this is the post-Katrina regime that I observed, and so I wanted to then look at, based on the work that all these folks in the room are doing, you know, different sectors in which we can see, well, what is the project that they put in place, and how does it affect people? And so in each sector, and I looked at tourism through the lens of restaurants, where I was doing some work, into construction, where I was doing some work, and manufacturing. And these are three key sectors, tourism and construction, because so much money was getting pumped into the city after Katrina. And so this capital that's coming in all of a sudden makes New Orleans attractive to national and global actors. Well, it was kind of, you know, things were going on, and there was certainly money to be made, but it's when that big money starts getting pumped in that those national and global actors get really interested in engaging locally, but they need local intermediaries. And so what we see in each sector, and I'll say a little bit about, I guess I'll start with services and restaurants, and then we'll see, you know, what there is time for, to kind of talk about the way that it operated, and what each chapter that looks at these sectors does is sort of describe what the globally integrated process of production in tourism and services look like, who are the big national and international actors, and how do they link up locally to factions of local capital, and what's the role of local capital in this? How do they reorganize the sector in order to enhance their profits by segmenting sectors along these descriptive racial and gendered and national origin lines? And then, you know, what's the worker experience as far as how these sectors operate, and then how do people resist? What is it that they do? And so in services, which was key, because there had been this tourism project all along in New Orleans that folks have been trying to put in place. But what we see is that national actors, and in restaurants, what you see are kind of celebrity chefs, are the national actors, and the capital that revolves around these celebrity chefs. They operate nationally, and it's their name, their brand that sort of allows these restaurant empires to operate. And they enter New Orleans, or they you know, increase their activity in New Orleans by finding local allies to kind of reorganize politics and regulation in the city, in the restaurant sector, in the service sector. So then New Orleans is this high-profit place that's attractive for them to do business, and they link up with these local actors as their allies. One of the main local intermediaries was the Louisiana Restaurant Association, and the Brennan family and different branches of the Brennan family that were active there. And they, set themselves up as the intermediaries for this national and international capital as it reaches and operates in New Orleans. And part of the way in which they did that, you can see on the Louisiana Restaurant Association website, they promise that they will help you do your business with the least regulation possible. And if you sign up for their insurance, the membership. Yeah, well, membership, but then and they sell insurance to the members in case of a workplace accident. Workers' comp. Yeah. So if you sign up for their workers' comp, they promise to pay out a lower rate than any other workers' comp insurance that's out there. This is like on their website. Like, there's no subtlety to it at all. And anyway, so they're clear about what they're offering, and so this is the story in each of the sectors that we looked at, which is that I kind of need that to know when I'm over time. But anyway, in each of the sectors, you see how a national capital gets interested. Halliburton gets interested in the big construction projects that are rebuilding New Orleans, but they need a local intermediary to help them navigate the politics, make sure that it's as deregulated as possible, etc. And then they find a local ally to help them do that. In the services sector, the surveys that students were doing, and that the Restaurant Opportunity Center was doing with the help of students and others, and the workers themselves, they turned up what this does for workers in the sector, as far as the kinds of inequalities, the kinds of mistreatments, the dangerous conditions that people face. And in fact, what you see is exactly the kind of segmentation that you might expect, or that they hit upon. If you want one of the few good jobs in restaurants in New Orleans, they're the front of the house jobs in fine dining restaurants. High price point restaurants in which is $20, $25 a plate. The servers who make good tips and the bartenders who make good tips, who are in the front of the house, they can make a decent living. But access to those jobs is reserved for only white people. And so in the city, you can see the statistics of sort of the survey responses. The only way to access those jobs was some inherent characteristic that has nothing to do with how good a server you are, or bartender. But if you're white, you might be able to access those jobs. There was a much lower percentage of those jobs were filled by people of color. Back of the house was the complete opposite. People of color and much lower as far as white people. And the conditions there, unsafe, low pay, insecure, all those characteristics, characterize that kind of work. If you were a black woman, you were assigned to quick serve. You're basically working in cafeterias and McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken, and those are the jobs that you have access to, not because you are not good at your job, but because that's where you're assigned, based on your gender and your race. And so this was the kind of segmentation that you can see, and it's so clear in these surveys. Ralph Brennan got wind of the fact that we were doing these surveys, and so he called Scott Cowan, who was the president of Tulane. He said, "You got to cut out these surveys." And did you hear about this? Yeah. So it's obnoxious. And so we told him to F off, and he did, because bullies are like that. But that's what they think that they can do, right? That they can reorganize these sectors without any check on their power. But workers didn't. The workers resisted, and they organized, and they resisted this attempt to kind of, shape their working lives in this way that was so connected to, their race and their gender and other characteristics. And so the Restaurant Opportunity Center, in my opinion, is just a great story of one of the ways in which workers resist. Restaurant Opportunity Center was created out of the 9/11 attacks, actually. So in New York, when the World Trade Center came down, the towers came down, at the top of it was a fine dining restaurant, and that restaurant, of course, everybody who was on duty died. The people who were not on duty, after having lost 150 of their friends and colleagues, they were not hired by the owner, who opened up a new fine dining restaurant. And the owner wanted to hire people at the bottom of the pay scale and not have to hire his old workers at the ranks that they were before. And workers recognized and realized that it's they had no power, they had no control over the way in which their workplace was organized and the way in which these decisions would be made. So they organized. And so the Restaurant Opportunity Center has organized data gathering, the surveys like that we were doing, the research, has organized campaigns around, they've organized policy campaigns and policy in response to that research. And they organize campaigns for particular bad actors to kind of call out these bad actors and show that the sector is being run this way and that there's an opportunity to resist. And so in New Orleans, Tony Romas was and some of the folks here were on the picket lines with the rest of the workers and calling out this one particular restaurant where the guy was stealing tips, he was not paying his workers, he was using the money for cocaine, he was not paying his taxes, he was assigning the workers of color to a zone of the restaurant upstairs where there were fewer tables and lower tips as a result. So he was just a real scumbag, and so he was the target of this campaign because he sort of epitomized all the worst of these practices that one could find in New Orleans. And Rock won a judgment, or I guess won a settlement with him, this owner, and there's a repayment of the lost wages to the workers who hadn't been paid. There was a employee handbook that had to be put in place. So these are those episodes in which there's a victory, in which there's resistance, and it's important to call it out. And one of the ways in which this episode and others were really interesting to me was because it expressed this joined up struggle of people identifying the attack on their humanity, their dignity, connected to their workplace lives, their working lives. And so one of the observations that came out of that particular campaign and other things that Rock did, and the way it was connected to the construction workers, Latino immigrant construction workers, some of them undocumented, who came to New Orleans to rebuild after Katrina, found that they were mistreated at much higher rates than native-born workers, mistreated in the form of wage theft. Well, they joined up with Rock through the Workers Center for Racial Justice, doing great work there. I know, yeah. And they were organizing immigrant workers in the construction sector, and they showed up to Rock protests, and Rock workers showed up to the Workers Center for Racial Justice protests. And one of the things that one of the people at the Workers Center for Racial Justice described to me, and he was a immigrant worker himself, and he said, for 200 years ago, they brought people to the U.S. and stripped them of their rights so they didn't have to pay them wages. And now, 200 years later, they're bringing people to the U.S. and stripping them of their rights so they don't have to pay them wages. And so by linking this understanding of what was going on, mistreatment of Latinx immigrants today to mistreatment of African American workers forever, this was a bond that could be built, that link, that working life to community life, to production, to social reproduction, in a way that I thought expressed something special and different. Let's see. I've got about 4 minutes, so I'll say a quick word about the manufacturing sector, because there was the project that was done in the Avondale shipyard, which is now shut down. And Avondale shipyard was a place that employed, at its peak, 17,000 workers, the biggest employer in the state of Louisiana. And these were unionized jobs. They were good jobs. They were jobs that people had won the right to some degree of control over the way in which the work was done. And people could enter, perhaps with a high school education or a little more. They could work up the process there, and they could learn and move in and out of that sector, the manufacturing sector, into the shipyard. When there was a lull in shipbuilding, they would move into other skilled work, and then they would move back into the shipbuilding sector. So it was a career that could be built around the existence of this shipyard, a lifetime career in manufacturing that could be built around this shipyard, but it was shut down. And it was shut down in part because, under my understanding, that globally oriented faction of local capital didn't want it anymore. They didn't want to share power in a sector where they didn't have complete control to deregulate and assign people in the way that they wanted, to segment in the way that they wanted. They were more interested in tourism and services and construction in a way that they could make big high profits now, and they weren't interested in saving the shipyard sector, despite the fact that this was a sector that supported whole communities and you know, a big part of the whole region. And so the experience of the shipyard workers was also telling in that, you know, they really felt like they had struggled, they had joined up their struggle in order to win their union. One of the shipyard workers said something along the lines of, you know, I'm a minister, and it was through the shipyard that I learned to struggle and to minister to my community, and to you know, take those skills and that understanding of organizing and take it into the community. And that was really important in Katrina, because of course it was those shipyard workers and other people who had those skills and had those decent jobs and were able to really bring back a neighborhood that were critical to communities being able to pull themselves together after Katrina. And what he also said, but now it's time for the community to help minister us. You know, that now the shipyard workers were hurting, they were under the threat of the shutdown, and they said it's time to bring the community back into the shipyard and really organize and resist the shutdown. They tried to call on churches and the community and unions, and you saw that mobilization, but clearly the local elite was not willing to save that sector, was willing to cast it aside, and with all that meant. So that's the book. It looks at these three different sectors, kind of describes what was going on in these sectors and the way in which workers found episodes of resistance and victory in these sectors and how that happened, how it was connected to this political transition that I think we can see in the institutional architecture of the city and how that had evolved over time. And I think it does tell us a lot about sort of the struggles that are going on in this city and many cities. And you know, as I faced the reviewers of this book, one of the things that they said, well, why are we losing? You know, why are we unable? What can we do now in the face of this kind of overwhelming, wiping out of cities and building of these globally integrated but very exclusionary regimes? And two concepts have sort of come out a little bit, I guess, in the work that I've done and the work that I continue to do since then. And one comes from Cedric Robinson, and he talks about negation of the negation, sort of a Hegelian idea that by rejecting what is being imposed, then you construct, you create something new. And in fact, you can see in those episodes of worker resistance, there's something new. You know, the thing that they were striving for in creating a different way of organizing work, and I'll stop here, different way of organizing work was a common project. And so, you know, people have called it commoning. David Harvey called it commoning. The idea that instead of creating systems that marketize and privatize and individualize everything, create things that allow for common enjoyment of goods, and things like school and neighborhoods and dignity in your community, and connect that to some common and democratic control over the workplace. And so it's those episodes that were trying to articulate some shared governance over the workplace built on a different sort of community organization and model that I think we can see in those episodes, and that offers some hope, and you know, I hope that those can be the ones that we can push forward. So thank you.